I still remember the first time I laid eyes on the Trinity Alps, as if the memory were carved into my bones. The range rose like a fortress against the northern California sky, jagged peaks of granite etched with veins of white snow that lingered even in late spring. Streams cut through the valleys like silver threads, their cold waters racing toward rivers that fed the wilderness for miles. When I arrived, it felt as though I had stepped into another world, a world that whispered secrets in the rustling of pines and dared me to unravel them. My name is Daniel Cross, and I was 31 years old when I set out on the solo hike that would define the rest of my life, or at least the part of it that anyone still remembers. I didn't have much back in the city, nothing that tethered me. A job that paid the bills but left me empty, a small apartment where the walls seemed to close in at night, and the quiet ache of realizing that I had somehow managed to make it through 3 decades without leaving behind anything that truly mattered. The Trinity Alps seemed to call me with a kind of magnetic pull, and so I answered, not knowing that the decision would write the darkest chapter of my story. I prepared for that trip with a mixture of determination and carelessness. I had hiked before, but never truly tested myself against wilderness that could swallow a man whole. My pack was heavy with food, gear, a tent, and a journal where I promised myself I would record every detail of the adventure. I had maps folded carefully in waterproof sleeves, a compass, and even a small GPS unit, though batteries were limited. Still, a piece of me believed that preparation was almost unnecessary. I was younger then, stronger, and brimming with a misplaced confidence that nothing bad would happen to me. Bad things happen to other people, the kind you read about in newspapers or hear whispered in diner booths, not to someone like me who believed he could muscle through anything with stubbornness alone. It's strange how the arrogance of youth clings to you long past the age when you should know better. I strapped on my boots, tightened the buckles of my pack, and walked into the mountains with a smile that, if I could see it now, would make me shake my head at my own foolishness. The first days were nothing short of bliss. The air was sharp and clean, filling my lungs with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Trails twisted upward through forests of fir and cedar, the scent of resin and damp moss hanging thick in the air. Deer bounded across my path, startled by my presence, and eagles circled high above, their cries echoing through the canyons like ancient voices. I made camp near a lake the first night, its surface so still that it mirrored the stars as though the sky had spilled onto the earth. I cooked a simple meal over a small fire, scribbled notes into my journal about the beauty of it all, and slept more deeply than I had in months. Each step the next day carried me farther from civilization and deeper into the kind of silence that hums in your ears. It wasn't loneliness, it was purity, the feeling that I was finally brushing up against the raw essence of life itself. I wanted to believe that I belonged there, that the wild was welcoming me as one of its own. By the 3rd day, I began to notice things that unsettled me, though I shrugged them off at the time. The trail, though marked clearly on my map, seemed to twist in ways I didn't remember studying. Rock cairns appeared in odd places, stacked in 3s or 5s, almost deliberate, as if someone had arranged them for reasons I couldn't understand. The woods grew denser, the canopy swallowing more light until I found myself in a twilight world even at midday. Birds grew scarce, and when they did call, their cries carried an edge of alarm, sharp and unnatural. I told myself it was all in my head, the paranoia of a man too used to city life, but somewhere deep inside me, a warning stirred. Still, I pushed forward, tightening the straps of my pack and convincing myself that I was simply exhausted. Fear, after all, is something we learn to smother when it threatens the illusion of control. That night, camped in a hollow where 2 ridges met, I had the first dream. It wasn't like any ordinary dream, more like a vision that pressed itself into my skull with the weight of reality. I saw myself standing in a clearing I hadn't yet reached, surrounded by pines that leaned inward as if listening. The ground was uneven, scarred with patches of bare earth where grass refused to grow. In the center was a mound, small but distinct, as though something had been buried there long ago. In the dream, I felt the pull to dig, to unearth whatever was hidden beneath, but just as I dropped to my knees, a shadow moved among the trees. I never saw its face, only the shape of something tall and wrong, its limbs bending at angles that made my stomach twist. I woke with a start, the fire reduced to embers, my skin slick with sweat despite the cold. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stared into the darkness, convinced for several long minutes that the shadow had followed me out of the dream and was standing just beyond the glow of my camp. The morning light did little to erase the unease. I packed quickly and set off, determined to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. But as I walked, the terrain grew stranger, less familiar, as though the mountains themselves were shifting beneath my feet. The path disappeared in places, swallowed by undergrowth or crumbled rock slides, and I found myself relying less on maps and more on instinct. That was my first mistake, though I wouldn't recognize it until much later. Hours blurred into a haze of exertion and doubt. By the time I stopped to rest, my GPS flickered with a weak signal, showing me miles away from where I thought I should be. Panic scratched at the back of my skull, but I swallowed it down. I was fine, I told myself. I had food, water, gear. All I needed was to retrace my steps, find the trail, and everything would be fine. But that trail never returned. Instead, the forest grew thicker, pressing against me with a weight that felt alive. The trunks of trees widened into giants, their bark scarred with gouges too high for any animal I knew. Strange symbols appeared carved into the wood, rough and jagged, like runes left by hands that hadn't held tools in centuries. I traced one with my fingers, the grooves deep and deliberate, and a shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The forest was no longer beautiful. It was watching, listening, breathing in ways I couldn't understand. I told myself I was imagining things, but when the wind stirred the branches, the whispers that followed carried syllables. Not words I could decipher, but fragments of something old, something patient. I pressed on because there was nothing else to do. Each step dragged me farther from the safety of the familiar and deeper into a place where the world seemed to fold in on itself. I lost track of time. Days slipped into one another, measured only by the dwindling supplies in my pack and the growing weight of exhaustion in my body. My journal, once filled with eager notes and sketches, became a record of desperation. Scribbled maps of landmarks I didn't recognize, half-mad ramblings about noises in the night, confessions of fear I couldn't voice aloud. I began to hear footsteps when I walked, always just behind me, matching my pace. I would spin around, heart racing, only to find nothing but trees stretching endlessly in every direction. Sleep offered no refuge, only more dreams of the shadow among the pines, always closer, always waiting. I don't know when I first realized that I was no longer merely lost but trapped. The mountains weren't letting me go. Paths I tried to follow looped back on themselves. Rivers I crossed reappeared behind me hours later. The world had become a labyrinth, one designed to confuse, to break me down piece by piece until I was too weak to resist. I told myself that if I just kept moving, I would eventually find my way out, but deep inside, I already knew the truth. The Trinity Alps had claimed me, swallowed me whole, and there was no going back. The longer I wandered those woods, the more the concept of time dissolved. Days no longer held shape. They bled into one another like watercolors on damp paper, indistinguishable, soft at the edges, impossible to contain. I tried marking tallies on tree trunks to keep track, carving one line for each sunrise I endured, but after a while, I began to stumble across the same trees already marked, sometimes bearing more notches than I remembered making. At first I thought exhaustion was playing tricks on me, that my mind was looping memories in circles just as my feet were tracing paths that led me back to where I'd begun. But eventually I realized it was something more. The forest itself seemed to bend reality, folding me into a maze where direction was meaningless and logic dissolved beneath the canopy. You could walk north for half a day and end up at the river you'd left behind in the morning, the current flowing mockingly in the same direction as before. You could swear you'd climbed higher into the mountains, only to find yourself descending into valleys you hadn't seen. I began to believe I'd stepped into a place where the rules of the world I knew no longer applied. At night, My dreams deepened into something cruel. They no longer teased me with glimpses of that mound in the clearing. They showed me the act itself. I dreamed of kneeling in the dirt, fingers clawing into the soil, pulling it apart handful by handful until something pale and smooth emerged beneath the earth.
Bone.
Always bone. Sometimes it was a skull with empty sockets that seemed to watch me even in the dream. Sometimes it was ribs, half buried like the hull of a shipwreck. Other times, it was entire skeletons, twisted in unnatural positions as though they hadn't died in peace, but in terror. And always, beyond the mound, the shadow waited, slender, towering, its limbs impossibly long. I could never see its face, but the pressure of its stare was so immense I often woke with my chest constricted, gasping as though the very air had been stolen from my lungs. I stopped writing in my journal after one such dream, when I discovered that words I didn't remember scrawling had appeared across a page in a handwriting that wasn't mine. They weren't in English, or in any language I knew. Harsh symbols, sharp and angular, filled the page like the runes carved into the trees I'd passed. I snapped the book shut, buried it deep in my pack, and tried to pretend it didn't exist. My food dwindled. I rationed it carefully, stretching each bite into 2, then into 3. Hunger gnawed at me constantly, turning every thought into an ache, a hollow echo in my stomach that refused to be silenced. I trapped small animals when I could, cooked them over sputtering fires, and tried not to notice the way their blood lingered under my nails. Once, I found a berry bush heavy with fruit, and in my desperation, I devoured as much as I could before remembering that not all things in the forest were safe. Hours later, sickness struck me like a storm. My stomach twisted violently, my throat burned, and I collapsed beside a creek, shaking uncontrollably. I thought it would be the end of me, that I would rot quietly in those woods, one more forgotten body among the countless that must have vanished in those mountains. But I didn't die. I recovered, slowly, weakly, as though the forest had decided to spare me, not out of mercy, but because it wasn't finished with me yet. The whispers came next. At first, faint, like wind threading through the branches, or water slipping over stone. But soon, I realized they were words, though not ones I could fully grasp. They slithered just beyond understanding, low and urgent, curling into my ears at night when I lay awake in the dark. Sometimes they sounded like voices overlapping one another, too many to count, like a crowd gathered just beyond sight. Other times it was only one voice, deep and resonant, speaking slowly as though each syllable carried unbearable weight. Once, when exhaustion drove me to the edge of madness, I whispered back, asking it what it wanted. The forest hushed for a moment, as though it had been waiting for me to ask, and then the answer came, clear and undeniable. Dig. I told myself it was only my imagination, a trick of sleep deprivation and fear, but the command burrowed into me like a seed. I couldn't stop thinking of the mound from my dreams, of the earth waiting to be torn open. My hands itched with the need to uncover it, though I didn't know where to look. The forest seemed to know, though. Every wrong turn, every looping path, every deception of terrain, all of it felt designed to push me toward that place. And finally, after what might have been weeks or months, I stumbled into a clearing that mirrored the one from my dreams. The pines leaned inward, their branches clawing at the sky. The grass was patchy, thin, unable to fully mask the dark soil beneath. And there, in the center, was the mound, exactly as I had seen it countless nights, waiting patiently for me to arrive. My knees buckled, not from exhaustion this time, but from something heavier, something that pressed down on me like invisible hands. The air in the clearing was dense, thick with a smell like rust and wet stone. I knew I should turn and run, that I should flee as far as my legs would carry me, but I couldn't. The forest had led me there, and now that I stood before the mound, I belonged to it. I dropped my pack, fell to my knees, and without hesitation, I began to dig. My fingers tore into the soil like claws, ripping away clumps of earth until my nails split and bled. Dirt filled the lines of my palms, packed beneath my nails, smeared across my face, when I wiped the sweat from my brow. Hours slipped away as I dug deeper, wider, my breath ragged, my body screaming in protest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The whispers urged me on, rising into a chorus that drowned out everything else, a choir of unseen mouths chanting the same single word. Dig. 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 I unearthed the first fragment as night fell. It was a shard of bone, smooth and pale, small enough to cradle in my palm. I stared at it under the dying light, heart hammering, and in that moment I knew with certainty that the mound was not natural. It was a grave. But not of one body, of many. I kept digging, feverishly, uncovering more bones tangled together, a chaos of skeletal remains that made no sense. Some were human, others were not. I held femurs too thick to belong to any man, skulls elongated in ways that defied anatomy, jaws lined with teeth too sharp to belong to prey. It was as though the mound was a pit where countless things had been discarded, things that had lived and died in those woods long before me. The more I uncovered, the louder the whispers grew, until they were no longer whispers but screams, battering my skull with a frenzy that made me sob as I dug. And then, in the middle of it all, my fingers struck something different. Not bone, not stone. Something smooth, solid, metallic. I clawed the dirt away with frantic urgency until I uncovered the edge of it. A box. Rusted, old, but intact. My heart stopped as I realized this was what the forest had wanted me to find, what the whispers had been driving me toward. With trembling hands, I dragged it free from the earth and sat in the moonlight staring at it. It was heavy, sealed with corroded clasps, its surface etched with the same symbols I had seen carved into the trees and scrawled across my journal. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. I was not the first to be lured here. Someone else, maybe long ago, had buried this thing. And now, 5 years after I vanished into those mountains, I had unearthed what should have remained hidden. The moment I touched it, the forest fell silent. No wind, no whispers, no sound at all, just a suffocating stillness, as though the entire world was holding its breath. I should have left it there. I should have buried it again, walked away, and never looked back. But I didn't. I carried it with me, heavy against my chest, knowing even then that my fate was sealed. The box weighed far more than it should have for its size, as though the earth itself had conspired to forge something dense and unyielding within it. Every step I took with it strapped awkwardly to my pack was like dragging chains, yet I could not bring myself to abandon it. My hands ached from digging, my nails cracked and caked with dried blood and soil, but even through the pain, I clutched the weight of that discovery like a sacred burden. I told myself I would find a place to stop, to rest, to pry it open carefully when I had the strength, but the truth was that I couldn't wait. The need to know what lay inside consumed me with a hunger fiercer than starvation. I walked for hours through the forest, the night pressing in close, the moonlight fractured through the branches overhead, until finally I stumbled into a hollow where the ground was soft enough to kneel without my bones grinding against stone. I dropped my pack, pulled the box into my lap, and ran my fingers across the strange symbols carved into its surface. They burned cold beneath my touch, as if the metal itself recoiled from my skin. I tugged at the rusted clasps. At first, they resisted, fused by time and corrosion, but with enough force they broke loose one by one. Each crack echoed through the stillness of the forest like a gunshot. When the last clasp fell away, I hesitated. A part of me screamed to stop, that whatever lay within was never meant to be seen again, that I was tearing open something that would not be easily closed. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, stronger than my own will, drove me onward. I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in rotting cloth that disintegrated at my touch, was a collection of objects that made no sense together. A knife with a handle carved from bone, its blade blackened as though it had been scorched in fire. A leather-bound journal, swollen and warped with age, its cover scrawled with the same jagged runes. A length of braided cord, frayed but strangely slick to the touch, like it had been soaked in oil that never dried. And at the very bottom, buried beneath the other items, was a mask. The mask was carved from wood dark as obsidian, its surface polished smooth, its features sharp and alien. The eyes were nothing more than slits, yet they seemed to bore straight into me, piercing whatever defenses I had left. The mouth was a narrow oval, neither smile nor frown, only emptiness. I held it gingerly, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I swore it pulsed faintly in my hands, as though alive. A smell rose from the box then, faint but unmistakable, the scent of decay, of something long dead but never at rest. I dropped the mask back into the box with a shudder, slamming the lid closed as if that could undo the mistake I had just made. But it was too late. The forest stirred around me, not with the usual rustle of branches or sigh of wind, but with something deeper, like a great exhale from lungs that had been holding breath for centuries. The silence shattered. From somewhere beyond the trees, a cry rose, long, guttural, and inhuman. It echoed off the mountains, threading through the valleys until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze, every muscle locked in terror. My instincts screamed at me to run, yet my body wouldn't obey. Then, just as suddenly, the sound died, swallowed by the night, leaving behind only the pounding of my heart in my ears. I don't remember sleeping that night, though I must have drifted in and out of uneasy unconsciousness, because I awoke at dawn with the box still in my arms. My dreams had been fragmented flashes of fire, of chanting voices, of figures in masks gathered in a circle around the mound I had dug open. When I tried to recall their faces, all I could see was the black wood of the mask from the box, replicated over and over, countless identical visages watching me. I stumbled to my feet, weak, hollow, my stomach gnawing itself, and decided I had to move. Staying in one place felt dangerous now, like the forest itself would collapse upon me if I lingered too long. The journal was the first thing I studied once I had the strength. Its pages, though warped and brittle, still held legible ink. The handwriting was spidery, uneven, written in both English and another language, filled with jagged symbols. The entry spoke of an expedition into the Trinity Alps decades earlier, perhaps even longer, though no specific year was ever given. The writer described a group of men drawn by rumors of gold and strange relics, lured deeper into the wilderness by whispers they could not resist. They found the mound, just as I had, and unearthed the same box I now carried. The journal grew more frantic as the pages went on, detailing nights of terror, of men disappearing one by one, of dreams filled with shadows and fire. The last entry was only a single phrase repeated over and over until the ink smeared into madness. The mask is the key. The mask is the key. The mask is the key. I slammed the book shut, ball rising in my throat. My hands shook as I realized I was repeating their mistakes, following the same path into oblivion. Yet, even knowing this, I couldn't bring myself to abandon the mask. I carried it with me, wrapped in cloth, tucked into my pack, its presence a weight heavier than the box itself. At times I thought I heard it whispering to me, faintly, just at the edge of hearing, a susurrus that blurred the line between thought and voice. When I walked, it seemed to grow warmer against my back, as though feeding on the heat of my body. The days that followed blurred into a waking nightmare. I wandered through terrain that no longer matched the contours of my map. Caves yawned open where no cliff should have been. Rivers forked and doubled back, splitting into streams that rejoined themselves in impossible loops. I found myself walking in circles not because I was careless, but because the land itself seemed to rearrange beneath my feet. I tried using the compass, the GPS, even crude landmarks, but nothing held steady. It was as though the Alps had become a living organism, reshaping its flesh to keep me inside. And all the while something followed me. I never saw it clearly, but I felt its presence in the way the hairs on my arms lifted when I stopped, in the way branches snapped just beyond sight, in the way the silence thickened whenever I dared to rest. Once, as dusk fell, I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, a figure tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its gait wrong, jerking like a marionette tugged by broken strings. My chest seized, and I ran without looking back, crashing through underbrush until my legs gave out. When I finally dared to glance behind me, there was nothing but the forest, calm and indifferent, yet I knew it had been real. I grew weaker, my body wasting away as hunger gnawed through flesh and bone. My reflection in streams became a stranger. Sunken eyes, gaunt cheeks, beard grown wild, lips cracked and raw. My voice, when I dared to speak aloud, sounded foreign, hoarse and broken, as though it no longer belonged to me. Still, I pressed on because stopping meant surrendering to the shadow that hunted me. And then came the night I finally put on the mask. I hadn't meant to. I told myself I never would, that the journal's warnings were clear enough. But desperation twists the mind, and fear carves away reason until only instinct remains. I was cold, delirious, shivering beneath a canopy that seemed to press closer with each passing hour. The whispers had become unbearable, drilling into my skull, hissing my name over and over, urging me to obey. My hands moved on their own, unwrapping the mask from its cloth cocoon. The wood was cold against my skin as I lifted it, trembling, and before I could think to resist, I pressed it to my face. The world shifted instantly. The forest vanished, replaced by a vast plain of ash beneath a blood-red sky. Towers of bone rose in the distance, jagged and twisted, crowned with fires that burned without smoke. Figures moved across the plain, cloaked and masked, their eyes glowing faintly like embers through the slits of their visages. They turned toward me in unison, and though they said nothing, I felt their welcome deep in my marrow. Behind them, towering above all, was the shadow I had glimpsed in my dreams, its limbs stretching impossibly high, its face obscured by darkness save for two burning coals where eyes should have been. It raised one long arm and beckoned to me. When I ripped the mask from my face, I was back in the forest, gasping, drenched in sweat. But the vision lingered, seared into my mind, impossible to erase. I understood then what the journal had meant. The mask wasn't just an artifact. It was a doorway, a key, and I had just unlocked it. After that night, the mask became more than just an object in my pack. It became a presence, a parasite that clung to me no matter how hard I tried to resist. I buried it once, in a shallow pit by a stream where the soil was soft, telling myself I would leave it behind, forget it existed, and escape the forest with what little sanity I still had. But by the next morning, when I awoke shivering in the dawn light, it was back in my pack, wrapped neatly in cloth as if I had never touched it. My stomach dropped, ball rising in my throat. I hadn't sleepwalked. I hadn't dug it up. It had returned on its own, or perhaps it had never left. From that moment on, I stopped thinking of the mask as something I carried, and began to understand that it carried me. The visions grew worse. Each time I slipped into unconsciousness, I was dragged back to that plain of ash beneath the red sky. The cloaked figures would gather, their movements ritualistic, their heads tilting in eerie unison as they watched me. Sometimes they would chant in low tones, the syllables thick and guttural, the same sounds I had once heard whispered through the trees. Other times, they would simply stand in silence, their attention fixed on me as though I were the center of some ceremony I didn't understand. The shadow never spoke, but its gestures became clearer, more insistent. It wanted me to approach, to step closer, to surrender myself entirely. I resisted for as long as I could, but every dream left me weaker, more hollowed out, until resisting felt like trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. My body deteriorated. Food became a memory, water a fleeting comfort. My ribs jutted against my skin, each breath rattling in my chest. I lost track of how many days had passed since I first uncovered the mound, since I had seen the last true sunrise. The forest itself seemed to decay with me. Trees grew twisted, their bark flayed open like wounds. Streams ran dark, metallic with a taste like rust. Animals grew scarce, and the few I encountered no longer fled at my presence. They only watched, their eyes glassy, their bodies gaunt, as if they too were under the forest's curse. I began to wonder if I was already dead, if my body had collapsed somewhere among the pines and what remained of me was only this, wandering, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. One evening, as I stumbled along a ridge, I found a campsite. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. The fire pit was still intact, stones arranged neatly, ashes gray, but not yet scattered by the wind. A torn sleeping bag lay nearby, weathered but usable. I rushed toward it, half expecting to find another hiker, someone who could save me, who could lead me out of the labyrinth I had become lost within. But the campsite was empty, abandoned long ago. Near the pit lay a small tin cup, still bearing the blackened rim of fire use, and beside it, half buried in leaves, was a boot. I pulled it free, my heart sinking as I realized it was no newer than a decade old, perhaps longer. A name was scratched faintly into the leather, worn down by time. Ellis. I dropped it immediately, as though it had burned me. I had heard stories, even before I set out on this journey, about Ellis Grant, a hiker who had vanished in the Trinity Alps years before me, swallowed whole by the wilderness. And now, standing in his campsite, I realized the forest had a history of taking men like me, dragging them into its depths, keeping their ghosts alive to haunt those who followed. That night, I dreamt of him. He stood among the cloaked figures, his face hidden behind the same mask I carried. When he removed it, his skin peeled away with it, leaving only muscle and bone beneath. He reached out to me, lips moving silently, and though no sound came, I understood what he was saying. Join us. I woke screaming, clutching my own face as though the mask had fused itself to my skin. My fingers trembled as I traced the lines of my cheeks, desperate to feel flesh still intact. The mask lay beside me, no longer wrapped in cloth, its hollow eyes reflecting the weak glow of the dying fire. The days stretched endlessly, yet I knew time in the outside world was passing. I thought often of those who might search for me, family, friends, strangers with dogs combing the mountainsides. I imagined helicopters circling overhead, search parties shouting my name into the trees. But in the depths of the forest, none of it reached me. The Alps were not simply vast. They were sealed. Once you stepped inside their true heart, you vanished from the maps of men. I began to accept that no one would ever find me, not alive, at least. It was the hunter who proved me wrong. I saw him one morning as I stumbled through a thicket, weak and half delirious. At first, I thought he was another vision, a mirage conjured by hunger and madness. He stood tall, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his orange vest bright against the muted greens and browns of the forest. For a moment, our eyes met, and in his face I saw shock, fear, and something else. Pity. He shouted something, words I couldn't process, and began moving toward me. I should have run to him, begged for help, fallen into his arms, and let him carry me out of the nightmare. But I didn't. I turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth like an animal. Because in that instant, I realized the mask was still in my hands, and I could not bear the thought of anyone else seeing it. It wasn't mine to give away. It wasn't mine to share. It owned me now, and it would not let me go. I don't know if the hunter followed. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he saw me vanish into the trees and never found me again. Perhaps he stumbled, as I once had, into the clearing with the mound and heard the whispers urging him to dig. Or perhaps he escaped, returned to his world, and told others of the gaunt, wild-eyed man he had seen in the Alps carrying something that should never have been unearthed. All I know is that from that day on, I no longer believed I was entirely lost. I was being kept, held here, in this labyrinth, not until rescue arrived, but until the forest decided my purpose was fulfilled. And each night, the shadow drew closer. The encounter with the hunter should have been my salvation, but instead it only deepened the chains that bound me to the forest. I thought of him often in the days that followed, his startled expression, the way his eyes widened when he saw the state I was in. To him, I must have looked less like a man and more like a specter, an echo of something already half dead. I wondered whether he had gone back, whether he had told others that he saw me, that I was still alive. But what would his words matter if no one could reach the place where I wandered? Even now, I believe the Trinity Alps warp themselves, closing like a fist around those who dare to venture too far in. Maybe he tried to guide others back to me, but if so, the forest would have erased the path, just as it had done with mine. I had lost everything by then, my sense of direction, my strength, even my voice, which had dwindled into a whisper from disuse. Only the mask remained constant, an anchor that tethered me in the storm of madness. It became harder to resist wearing it. The visions it granted were terrible, yes, but at least they gave me clarity, direction. Without it, I wandered aimlessly in circles. With it, I saw glimpses of a world that explained why I was here, even if the truth was unbearable. I began to think of the mask as a companion rather than a curse. I spoke to it in the dark, told it of my hunger, my fear, my longing for release. And sometimes I swore it spoke back, not with words I could hear, but with impressions, with urges that bent my thoughts until I could no longer distinguish them from my own. The dreams grew bolder. No longer confined to that barren plain beneath the red sky, they expanded into vast cities carved from bone and stone, lit by flames that burned in colors my waking mind struggled to name. I saw temples filled with masked figures kneeling in endless rows, their bodies swaying as one while they chanted in guttural tones that shook the ground beneath them. And always, the shadow presided over it all, its towering form blotting out the horizon, its arms raised as though conducting an orchestra of madness. In some dreams, I approached it willingly, bowing before it, offering the mask as a token. In others, it seized me in its elongated hands and lifted me high, my body trembling with both terror and awe as it lowered its faceless visage toward mine. I would wake from those dreams drenched in sweat, gasping, my chest aching as though something heavy had pressed against it all night. It was after one such dream that I began to hear the singing. Faint at first, like the murmur of wind through the trees, but soon louder, clearer, a low, rhythmic chant carried on the air. I followed it without question, my feet moving as though they belonged to someone else. Through thickets, across streams, over ridges, until I found myself standing before another clearing. This one was larger than the mound, ringed with ancient stones that jutted from the ground like crooked teeth. In the center, a fire burned, not natural flame, but a pale blue glow that flickered without smoke. Around it moved figures cloaked in shadows, their faces obscured by masks identical to the one I carried. My heart thundered in my chest. I had stumbled upon them, the others. Not dream, not vision. Real. They didn't speak to me. Not in words I understood, but their heads turned in unison as I stepped into the clearing. The chanting stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against my skull. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then, one of them extended a hand, palm open, beckoning. I should have run. I should have fled into the forest, and never looked back. But my body betrayed me. My hand moved to my pack, pulled free the mask, and before I could stop myself, I placed it over my face. The world shifted again, but this time I did not leave my body behind. I saw the clearing as it truly was, not with trees and stones, but with pillars of bone, towering spires of flesh, rivers of blood snaking through the ground. The figures around the fire were no longer cloaked but naked, their skins stretched tight over bones, their eyes hollow yet burning with inner light. They swayed as one, their voices rising in a chant that shook the ground. And in the center, where the blue flame burned, the shadow descended, taller than the trees, its presence so immense I thought my body would collapse beneath its weight. Reached for me, not with hands, but with thought, with will. My mind screamed, but my body bowed, sinking to my knees as the chant rose higher. The mask grew hot against my skin, searing me, yet I could not tear it away. The shadow bent low, its faceless void hovering inches from my own, and in that moment, I understood. It was not merely a creature, not a god, not even something that could be named. It was hunger itself, a force older than the mountains, older than the earth. and I was its offering. When I tore the mask away, the clearing was empty again. No fire, no figures, no shadow. Only me, kneeling in the dirt, clutching the mask with trembling hands. My face throbbed with burns, the outline of the mask seared into my flesh. Tears blurred my vision, but I did not cry from pain. I cried because I understood now that I would never leave. The forest had chosen me, just as it had chosen Ellis, just as it had chosen countless others before. We were not lost, we were taken. The days that followed were not days at all. They were fragments, moments of clarity drowned in tides of madness. Sometimes I wandered, sometimes I knelt in one place for hours, unmoving, the mask clutched against my chest. I no longer felt hunger or thirst, though I knew my body was wasting away. My ribs showed starkly beneath my skin, my eyes sunk deep into my skull, yet I continued on, driven not by survival, but by purpose. I belonged to the shadow now. The Alps were no longer wilderness, they were its temple, and I was one of its disciples. It is strange to confess, but I found peace in that realization. The fear that had once gnawed at me dulled, replaced by a terrible calm. I no longer fought the whispers, I listened. I no longer fled the visions, I welcomed them. And slowly, I began to lose the distinction between waking and dreaming. Whether I stood in the forest or the ash plains, whether I saw trees or towers of bone, whether I walked alone or among the massed figures, it no longer mattered. All of it was true. All of it was one. And so I waited. For what, I did not know. For the hunter to return? For the forest to finally close its grip? For the shadow to claim me entirely? Whatever it was, I knew it would come. And when it did, I would not resist. The seasons must have passed, though I no longer kept track of them. Time was a language I had forgotten, erased by the constant echo of the forest's voice and the weight of the mask that bound me. My body had long ago surrendered to the wilderness. I was a ghost of the man who had first entered these mountains, skin stretched thin over brittle bones, hair matted and grayed beyond its years, hands rough and scarred from clawing through earth and stone. But the strangest part was that I did not care. Hunger and thirst no longer guided me. Pain was no longer punishment. I had become something different, something unrecognizable even to myself. And still I roamed. Every step I took seemed to carry me deeper into a labyrinth I could never map, though I had long since ceased trying to find the way out. The Trinity Alps were no longer a place. They were a living presence, pulsing and shifting, breathing through the trees and the soil. Paths that once opened before me were gone when I looked back. Landmarks, I swore, I had passed moments before dissolved into shadows. I understood then why Ellis had carved his words, why he had left warnings for those who might stumble upon his fate. There was no leaving. There was only the slow unraveling of oneself, until man and forest were indistinguishable. And then came the day when I heard it again, the singing. It had been silent for weeks, maybe months, but one morning it returned, rising like a low tide that swept through the woods. My heart no longer panicked at the sound. Instead, I welcomed it, letting it lead me once more. The voice wound through valleys, across ridges, through stands of trees older than memory itself, until it carried me to a place I had never seen before, a cave mouth yawning black against the mountainside. The air that exhaled from it was cold, damp, heavy with the smell of stone and rot. Without hesitation, I entered. The walls pressed close around me, slick with moisture, the ground uneven beneath my steps. I carried no torch, yet I could see. The faint glow of phosphorescent lichen painted the cave in shades of sickly green. The singing grew louder as I descended, echoing from every direction until it felt like the stone itself was vibrating with the sound. My chest tightened, but I continued, deeper and deeper, until I reached the chamber. It was vast, a cathedral hidden beneath the earth. Stalagmites rose like columns, stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and in the center was a pit, bottomless, as far as my eyes could tell. The singing poured from it, an endless chant that rose from the depths. Around the edge of the pit stood figures, their masks gleaming pale in the dim light. I recognized them, though I had never met them. Ellis and others like him. The lost. The vanished. Hikers, hunters, wanderers swallowed by the Alps across decades, maybe centuries. Their bodies were withered, gaunt, almost skeletal, yet they moved with purpose, swaying in rhythm to the song that surged from the pit. They turned to me as one, and for the first time, they spoke, not in the guttural chants of the dreams, but in a tongue I could understand. "You are called." Their voices blended into a single note, vibrating in my skull until I thought my head might split. My knees buckled, and I fell forward, crawling toward the pit. I clutched the mask to my chest, feeling its heat sear my flesh once more, and I knew the time had come. I placed the mask upon my face. There was no sudden vision this time, no lurch into dream. Instead, the world peeled away like a skin. The chamber dissolved, the figures melted into shadows, and I stood once more upon the barren plain beneath the red sky. The pit lay before me, but now it was vast beyond comprehension, stretching endlessly into the horizon. And from within it, the shadow emerged, rising higher, larger, until it towered above the world. Its faceless void fixed upon me, and I felt my soul laid bare. Every memory, every fear, every hope stripped away until nothing remained but raw essence. I did not fight. I did not beg. I offered myself. The shadow's arms extended, enfolding me in darkness, and for the first time since I had entered the Alps, I felt whole. No longer fractured, no longer lost. The forest, the dreams, the hunger, the voices, it all fused into one truth. I was not a man wandering the wilderness. I was part of something older, vaster, beyond the comprehension of mortals. The Alps were its body, the cave its heart, the mask its eye. And I was its voice. When I awoke, I was back in the cave. The figures around the pit were gone. The mask was no longer in my hands, nor on my face. It was within me, fused to my skin, etched into my bones. I rose on unsteady legs and looked into the pit. The singing had stopped, but its echo pulsed through me. I understood now. I was to remain, to wait, to bear witness, to lure the next soul who wandered too far into these mountains. That is what the hunter will find, should he return. Not a man begging for rescue, but something else, something that wears the memory of a man like clothing. He will dig and find the remnants of what I once was, bones scattered, flesh gone, yet the truth will not lie there. The truth is buried deeper, in the roots of this forest, in the stone of these mountains, in the endless hunger that breathes through every shadow. And so I speak these words, not as a plea, but as a record. If you hear them, if you read them, know this: the Trinity Alps do not lose those who wander. They keep them, they transform them, they consume them. I am proof. Ellis was proof. And those who come after will be proof as well. I no longer fear this fate. I no longer mourn the life I once lived. I am part of the shadow now, part of the forest, part of the endless cycle. And when the next hiker steps into these woods, when the next hunter follows a trail too far, when the next lost soul seeks solace in the wilderness, I will be waiting. Not to save them, not to warn them, but to guide them into the darkness, into the song, into the embrace of what lies beneath. The Trinity Alps are alive, and I am their voice.